Sergeant Jake Lawson sighed as he rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness from hours of driving. He had been on the road for nearly 6 hours, heading back home after visiting an old Marine buddy. The highway stretched endlessly before him, and the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he spotted a small rest stop ahead, he decided to pull in. A cup of coffee and a quick stretch would do him good. He signaled and steered into the parking lot, which was nearly empty except for a few scattered cars. Jake climbed out of his truck, stretching his legs. The rest stop was quiet. Just a small convenience store, a couple of vending machines, and a row of benches under a dimly lit shelter. A few travelers were around, but one pair immediately caught his attention. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13 years old, sat stiffly on a bench. Beside her, a scruffy-looking man in his late 40s lounged with one arm stretched along the back of the bench. His other hand rested firmly on the girl's wrist. Jake noticed her small shoulders were tense, her hands clenched in her lap. She wasn't talking or looking at the man, just staring straight ahead like she was afraid to move. Something didn't feel right. Jake grabbed a bottle of water from a vending machine and leaned casually against a nearby post, keeping the pair in his line of sight. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but years in the Marines had taught him to trust his instincts. The girl's body language screamed fear. As he unscrewed the cap from his bottle, she turned her head slightly and met his gaze for the briefest moment. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, her fingers twitched in her lap. It was a small, almost unnoticeable motion. 3 quick taps with her index and middle fingers, then a pause, then 3 more. Jake's breath caught. It was the SOS distress signal. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but he had learned it in training. The realization sent a chill through him. This girl wasn't just scared, she was asking for help. Jake's grip on the bottle tightened. He forced himself to stay calm, to think. He couldn't just rush in without knowing the full situation. The man was bigger than the girl, but Jake could handle him if it came down to it. The real danger was what the man might do if he realized Jake was onto him. If this was an abduction, the last thing Jake wanted was for the guy to panic and hurt her. Keeping his expression neutral, Jake took a slow sip of water, pretending to glance around lazily. He needed to act smart. He needed a plan. The girl had given him a silent call for help. Now, it was up to him to answer it. Jake's heartbeat quickened, but he kept his face calm. He had seen danger before, on the battlefield and in tough situations. But this was different. This was a young girl silently crying for help, and he had to be smart about what came next. He glanced at the man beside her. The guy looked rough. Greasy hair, wrinkled shirt, dirt under his fingernails. He had a hard face, the kind that had seen trouble. But what worried Jake the most was the way he held the girl's wrist. It wasn't a normal, relaxed grip. It was tight, firm, like he was making sure she wouldn't run. Jake turned slightly, pretending to check his phone while keeping them in his peripheral vision. He had to think fast. If he confronted the man too soon, things could go wrong. If this was an abduction, the guy might try to run, or worse, hurt the girl. Then Jake had an idea. He took a deep breath and walked over casually, acting like any other traveler, stretching his legs. "Hey, man," he said with a friendly nod to the guy. "You got the time." The man looked up, caught off guard. Yeah. He loosened his grip just enough to check his watch. That moment was all Jake needed to get a better look at the girl's face. She had wide, fearful eyes. Her lips trembled slightly. "Thanks," Jake said, glancing down at her. "You okay, kiddo?" She opened her mouth like she wanted to speak, but the man's grip tightened again. "She's fine," the man answered quickly, his tone sharp. "She's my niece. We're waiting for her mom to pick us up." Jake nodded slowly, pretending to believe him, but his gut told him the man was lying. Something was off. He noticed something else, too. The girl's fingers twitched again. This time, she barely moved them, just a tiny flicker against her lap. SOS. Jake had seen enough. He wasn't leaving without making sure this girl was safe. He pulled out his phone and pretended to check messages. In reality, he was texting the police. "Suspicious man with young girl. Rest stop off Highway 17. Possible abduction. Need officers ASAP. He kept his face neutral as he hit send. Then he acted like he had just remembered something. "Hey, I think I've seen you before," Jake said, looking at the man curiously. "You work around here?" The man frowned. "Nah, we're just passing through." Jake nodded, watching his reaction. The guy shifted uncomfortably and looked around, like he was checking for an escape route. That was another red flag. Jake decided to push a little more. "Where you headed?" The man hesitated. North." That was vague. Too vague. Most people would just say the name of a city or town. Jake glanced at the girl again. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting between him and the man. He needed to keep things calm until the police arrived. So he did the opposite of what the man expected. He grinned and clapped him on the shoulder like they were old buddies. "Safe travels, man. Hope your niece gets picked up soon." The guy stiffened but forced a nod. "Yeah, thanks." Jake walked back toward his truck, pretending to leave, but in reality, he was watching them closely. If the guy tried to take off with the girl, Jake would be ready. He just hoped the cops got there in time. Jake walked slowly back toward his truck, but his mind was racing. He had to keep an eye on the man without making him suspicious. His military training had taught him patience, strategy, and reading people. And right now, everything about this situation screamed danger. He leaned against his truck, pretending to check his phone while keeping the man and the girl in his peripheral vision. The man was looking around now, his fingers drumming against his leg. He seemed nervous. Maybe he had noticed Jake watching him. Then, something changed. The man stood up, pulling the girl with him. She stumbled slightly as he yanked her wrist. He muttered something to her, and they started walking toward the parking lot. Jake's heart pounded. He's trying to leave. If this guy got into a car with the girl before the cops arrived, she could disappear forever. He couldn't let that happen. Jake glanced at the highway. No police lights yet. "I need to stall him." Thinking fast, Jake grabbed his truck keys and casually stepped forward, blocking their path just enough to slow them down. "Hey," he said, smiling like he was just making conversation. "You sure you're okay, kiddo?" The girl's mouth opened slightly, but before she could speak, the man squeezed her wrist hard. She winced. "She's fine," the man said quickly, his voice tight. "Like I told you before, we're just waiting for her mom." Jake nodded slowly, pretending to accept the answer, but he noticed something important. There were no cars in the parking lot except his truck, a beat-up sedan, and a couple of big rigs. If they were waiting for someone, where was the car? Something wasn't adding up. Jake decided to press a little more. "You know, I've got a little sister about her age," he said casually. "She gets nervous in new places too." He glanced at the girl again. "You sure you're okay, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated. Then, ever so slightly, she gave the tiniest shake of her head. It was barely noticeable, but Jake caught it. That was all he needed. He smiled at the man again, acting friendly, but inside, he was ready for anything. "Where's your car?" he asked. The man's jaw clenched. "It's, over there," he said, nodding toward the sedan. But Jake saw hesitation in his eyes. He's lying. That was the final red flag. Jake shifted slightly, making sure he was in the man's way. He had to keep him here just a little longer. Then, finally, he heard it. The distant sound of sirens. The man heard them too. His eyes darted toward the road, and his grip on the girl tightened. "We gotta go," he muttered, pulling her forward. Jake stepped in front of them. "Hold on, man. What's the rush?" The man's eyes flickered with panic. He knew. The cops were almost here, and he was trapped. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet evening air. Jake saw the man's grip on the girl tighten. His whole body tensed, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He knew the police were coming. Jake had to act now. The girl's eyes were wide with fear. Her small hands trembled at her sides. She wasn't trying to run. Maybe she was too scared to. The man took a step back, pulling her with him. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. He turned, trying to walk away fast. Jake moved before thinking. He stepped right into the man's path, blocking his way. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why are you in such a hurry?" The man's face twisted with anger. "Get out of my way," he snapped. His voice was lower now, harsher. Jake didn't move. He squared his shoulders, standing tall. "Not until I know this girl is safe." The man's grip on the girl tightened. She whimpered, barely a sound, but Jake caught it. His blood boiled. This was it. The man turned fast, too fast. He tried to yank the girl behind him, like he was about to run. Jake's training kicked in. In one swift move, he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it, forcing him to let go of the girl. The man yelped in pain, stumbling backward. "Run," Jake told the girl. She hesitated for a second, then she bolted toward the gas station nearby. The man lunged at Jake, his face twisted with rage. He swung wildly, but Jake dodged easily. He had been in real fights before. This guy was no match for a Marine. Jake caught the man's arm and spun him around, pinning him face down on the pavement. "Stay down," he ordered. The sirens were right outside now. Red and blue lights flashed as a police car screeched to a stop. Two officers jumped out. "Hands where we can see them," one shouted. Jake raised his hands and stepped back. "He tried to run with the girl," he said quickly. "She's safe. She ran over there." He pointed toward the gas station, where an employee was comforting the girl. The officers rushed in. One cuffed the man, who was still cursing and struggling. The other officer looked at Jake. "You the one who called this in?" Jake nodded. "Yeah." The girl signaled for help. "I couldn't just walk away." The officer nodded, his face serious. "You probably just saved her life." Jake exhaled, the tension finally leaving his body. He looked over at the girl. She was still shaking, but she was safe now. That was all that mattered. As the police led the man toward the patrol car, Jake knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing. And he wouldn't forget this moment for the rest of his life. The flashing red and blue lights painted the rest stop in streaks of color. The air was filled with the crackle of police radios and the murmur of officers speaking to each other. Jake stood near his truck, watching as the man was shoved into the back of the patrol car. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his face twisted in frustration. Jake's focus, however, was on the girl. She sat on a bench near the gas station, wrapped in a jacket that one of the gas station employees had given her. Her legs were pulled up to her chest, and she was staring at the ground. Even though she was safe now, she looked lost, like she still couldn't believe what had just happened. One of the officers, a woman with a kind face, knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" The girl hesitated. She bit her lip, glancing at Jake for a second before answering in a small voice. "Emma." Jake exhaled slowly. "Emma. She has a name. She's not just a scared girl anymore. She's a person who deserves to be safe." The officer smiled. "That's a pretty name. Emma, do you know where your parents are?" Emma swallowed hard, then shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I was at the mall. Then he took me." Jake felt his jaw tighten. She had been kidnapped. One of the officers turned to the radio and spoke into it. "We have a possible abduction victim, running her name now." Emma looked up at Jake again, her eyes filled with something like gratitude, but also fear. Jake took a step closer, crouching down so he was at eye level with her. "You were really brave back there," he said softly. "You did the right thing by signaling for help." Emma's lip quivered. "I didn't think anyone would notice." Jake gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I noticed. And now you're safe." Just then, the radio crackled, and an officer's voice came through. "We have a missing person report matching the girl's description. Parents have been looking for her since this afternoon. They're on their way now." Emma's eyes widened. "My mom and dad?" she asked, her voice shaking. The officer nodded. "They're coming. Sweetheart, you're going home." A sob escaped Emma's lips, and she wiped at her face with her sleeve. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to crash down on her at once. Jake stood up, stepping back to give her space. Relief washed over him. She was going to be okay. One of the officers walked over to Jake. "You did good, man," he said. "Without you, this could have ended a lot worse." Jake shook his head. "She's the real hero. She found a way to ask for help. The officer nodded. Still, most people would have ignored it. You didn't. He glanced toward the patrol car, where the suspect sat in handcuffs, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. That guy's got a record. This wasn't the first time he tried something like this. But thanks to you, it'll be the last. Jake crossed his arms, letting the words sink in. He didn't need a medal or a thank you. He just needed to know that Emma was safe, and she was. As he watched the young girl wipe away her tears, knowing her parents were on their way, he felt something deep in his chest, something stronger than pride. He had been in the right place at the right time, and he had done the right thing. That was all that mattered. The night air was cool as Jake stood near his truck, watching the scene unfold. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pavement, but the danger had passed. Emma was safe. The man who had taken her was in handcuffs. Now, there was only one thing left: the reunion. A car pulled into the rest stop, braking suddenly. The driver's door flew open before the car even came to a full stop. A woman ran out, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. A man followed closely behind her, his steps unsteady, his face filled with worry. "Emma," the woman cried. Emma lifted her head, her breath hitching. "Mom." Then, like a switch had flipped, she sprang from the bench and ran straight into her mother's arms. Jake watched as the mother fell to her knees, wrapping Emma in the tightest hug imaginable. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked her daughter back and forth. "Oh, baby, we've been looking everywhere for you," she sobbed. "We were so scared." Emma clung to her, crying, her small hands gripping her mother's sweater. I thought I'd never see you again." The father dropped to his knees beside them, wrapping his arms around both of them. His chin trembled, and he blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. "You're home now, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're safe." Jake swallowed the lump in his throat, even after everything he had seen as a Marine. After all the chaos, the close calls, the moments of life and death, this moment hit him harder than he expected. This was what mattered. The police gave the family a moment before stepping in. "Sir, ma'am," one officer said gently, "we're going to need a statement from you both, and we'll need to take Emma to the station for a full checkup. But for now, just take your time." The mother nodded quickly, still holding Emma like she was afraid to let go. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." The officer smiled kindly. "Your daughter is very brave, and this man here," he nodded toward Jake, "is the reason she's standing here right now." The mother turned to look at Jake, her eyes filled with emotion. "You saved my little girl." Jake rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a little awkward under the attention. "She saved herself," he said. "She gave the signal. I just listened." But before he could say anything else, the mother stood up and wrapped him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice breaking. Jake hesitated for a second, then patted her back gently. "I'm just glad she's okay." When she pulled away, Emma was looking at him too. She stepped forward, still sniffling. "You're the first person who noticed," she said quietly. "I thought no one would." Jake knelt down so he was at eye level with her. "You did everything right," he said. "You were strong. You didn't give up. That's what saved you." Emma wiped her nose and gave a small nod. Then, to his surprise, she threw her arms around his neck in a hug. "Thank you." Jake felt his heart tighten. He hugged her back gently. "Anytime, kiddo." As she pulled away and returned to her parents, Jake finally allowed himself to take a deep breath. The weight that had been sitting on his chest since he first saw Emma's silent SOS had finally lifted. She was safe, and that was all that mattered. Jake leaned against his truck, watching Emma and her family. The mother still had her arms around her daughter, as if she was afraid to let go. The father kept running his hand over Emma's hair, whispering words Jake couldn't hear. The police were wrapping things up now. One officer was speaking with the parents, taking down information. Another was standing by the patrol car, making sure the man who had taken Emma wasn't causing trouble. Jake knew his part in this was over. Emma was safe, her family was here, and the police had the situation under control. Still, something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way Emma kept glancing in his direction, like she wasn't ready to say goodbye yet. Finally, the officer who had first spoken to Jake walked over. "Looks like everything's in order," he said. "We've confirmed Emma's identity, and her parents are taking her to the station for some final paperwork." Jake nodded. "Good, she belongs with them." The officer studied him for a second. "Not everyone would have noticed what you did, and even fewer would have stepped in." Jake shrugged. "I just did what anyone should do." The officer smiled. "Well, maybe, but most people don't." He extended his hand. "You did good tonight, Jake." Jake shook his hand. "Thanks, officer." As the officer walked away, Jake opened his truck door, ready to leave. But before he could get in, he heard a small voice behind him. "Wait." He turned. Emma was running toward him, her small feet barely making a sound on the pavement. Her mother followed slowly behind, watching with soft eyes. Jake stepped away from his truck, crouching down as Emma stopped in front of him. "What's up, kiddo?" he asked. Emma bit her lip, looking down for a second before meeting his eyes. "Are you leaving?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, my job here is done." She frowned. "I don't want you to go." Jake smiled gently. "You're safe now, Emma. That's what matters." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, colorful bracelet, one of those handmade ones made of woven threads. She held it out to him. "I made this at school," she said shyly. "It's my favorite one. I want you to have it." Jake looked at the tiny bracelet, his heart tightening. It was blue and green, a little uneven in places, but full of care. He carefully took it from her hands. "Are you sure?" Emma nodded firmly. "You're my hero." Jake swallowed hard. He had been called a hero before, by his fellow Marines, by people he had protected in war zones. But this felt different, more real. "Thank you, Emma," he said softly. She smiled. Then, before he could react, she gave him one last hug. Jake hugged her back, feeling something deep inside him shift, something he couldn't quite name. As she pulled away and ran back to her parents, Jake looked down at the bracelet in his hand. He slid it onto his wrist. Then, with one last glance at Emma and her family, he climbed into his truck and drove away, carrying a memory he would never forget. The highway stretched ahead, dark but peaceful. Jake drove in silence, the soft hum of his truck's engine the only sound around him. The night was quiet now, far different from the chaos of earlier. But in his mind, he could still hear Emma's small voice. "You're my hero." He glanced down at his wrist, where the tiny woven bracelet rested. The blue and green threads stood out against his rough skin, a reminder of the little girl he had helped. A part of him still couldn't believe it had happened. One moment, he had been stopping for a quick break. The next, he was in the middle of something that could have ended in tragedy. What if I hadn't noticed her signal? The thought sent a chill through him. What if I had just walked away? But he had noticed, and because of that, Emma was safe with her family. Jake exhaled, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. After years in the military, he had always believed that the biggest battles were fought on distant battlefields. But tonight had taught him something new. Sometimes, the most important battles happen in everyday moments, in the places no one expects. And heroes aren't just soldiers. Sometimes, they're just ordinary people who decide to act. As he drove, his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He reached over and picked it up at the next red light. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "This is Emma's mom. We just wanted to say thank you again. We'll never forget what you did for our daughter. You are forever in our prayers." Jake smiled to himself. He didn't need thanks. Knowing Emma was safe was enough. But as he put the phone down and continued driving, he realized something. This moment, this night, had changed him too. He had spent so much of his life looking for purpose, for a way to keep making a difference even after leaving the military. Maybe he had just found it. Because tonight had proven something to him. One person paying attention can change a life. And from now on, no matter where he was, Jake knew he would always be that person. As the miles passed and the road stretched ahead, he tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, feeling the bracelet around his wrist. A simple gift from a little girl. A reminder that doing the right thing could make all the difference in the world. And as the night faded behind him, he drove forward, toward whatever came next.